Okay, this is going to be part 91 of Nos4a2, but I wanted to say that including today, there's 11 parts, but after this there's only 10, which means that we have only a little bit under 2 weeks, or over a week, to get this done. So that's exciting. Okay, here we go. Dover, New Hampshire. A loud clap like the world's biggest door slamming shut, an electronic squeal, a deafening roar of static. Tabitha Hutter shouted and flung her headphones down. Daltrey, sitting on her right, flinched but kept his own headphones on for a moment longer, his face screwed up in pain. "What just happened?" Hutter asked Cundy. 5 of them were packed in the rear of a panel truck that said King Boar Deli on the side, fitting considering they were jammed in like sausages. The truck was parked next to a sit-go station across the road and 100 feet south of the drive that led up to Christopher McQueen's house. They had teams in the woods closer to McQueen's cabin shooting video and using parabolic microphones to listen in. The footage and sound were being broadcast back to the truck. Until a moment ago, Hutter had been able to see the driveway on a pair of monitors rendered in the supernatural emerald of night vision. Now, though, they showed only a blizzard of green snow. The picture had gone out at the same time they lost their sound. One moment, Hutter had been listening to Chris McQueen and Lewis Comedy speaking in low voices in the kitchen. McQueen had been asking Lou if he wanted coffee. In the next instant, they were gone, replaced by a furious blast of radio hiss. "Don't know," Cundy said. "Everything just went down." He jabbed at the keyboard of his little laptop, but the screen was a smooth face of black glass. "It's like we got hit with a motherfucking EMP. Cundy was funny when he swore, a dainty little black man with a piping voice and the trace of a British accent, pretending he was street instead of MIT. Daltrey tugged his own headphones off. He peeked down at his watch and laughed, a dry, startled sound that had nothing to do with amusement. "What?" Hutter asked. Daltrey turned his wrist so she could see the face of his watch. It looked almost as old as he was, a watch with a clock face and a tarnished silver band that had probably been tinted to look like gold once upon a time. The second hand rolled around and around, moving backward. The hour and minute hands had both frozen perfectly still. "It killed my watch," he said. He laughed again, this time looking toward Cundy. "Did all this shit do that? All your electronics? Did all this shit just blow up and wipe out my watch?" "I don't know what did it," Cundy said. "Maybe we was touched by lightning." "What fucking lightning? You hear any thunder?" "I did hear a loud clap," Hutter said, just as everything cut out. Daltrey put a hand in the pocket of his coat, tugged out his cigarettes, then seemed to remember that Hutter was sitting beside him, and gave her a sidelong glance of wry disappointment. He let the pack slip back into his pocket. "How long will it take to get video and sound restored?" Hutter asked. "It could have been a sunspot," Cundy said, as if she hadn't spoken. "I've heard the sun is kicking up with a solar storm." "Sunspot," Daltrey said. He placed his palms together as if in prayer. "You think sunspot, huh? You know, I can just tell you went to 6 years of college and majored in neuroscience or something, because only a truly gifted mind could talk himself into such utter horseshit. It's dark out. I'm going to spell it because I don't want to say it. Autistic. Fuck. "Cundy," Hutter said, before Cundy could come around in his chair and start some kind of male dick measuring contest. "How long before we're back online?" He shrugged. "I don't know, 5 minutes, 10, to reboot the system? Unless there's a nuclear war going on out there, in which case it'll probably take longer." "I'll go look for a mushroom cloud," Tabitha Hutter said, getting up off the bench and doing a shuffle sideways walk toward the rear doors. "Yeah," Daltrey said. "Me too. If the missiles are flying, I want to smoke before we get wiped out." Hutter turned the latch, opened the heavy metal door to the damp night, and jumped down. Mist hung beneath the streetlights. The night throbbed with insect song. Across the street, fireflies lit the ferns and weeds in gassy green flashes. Daltrey lowered himself down beside her. His knees cracked. "Christ," he said. "I thought for sure I'd be dead of something at this age." His company did not cheer her, but only made her more conscious of her own aloneness. Hutter had believed she would have more friends by now. The last man she dated said something to her shortly before they broke up. "I don't know, maybe I'm boring, but I never really feel like you're there when we're out to dinner. You live in your head. I can't. No room for me in there. I don't know, maybe you'd be more interested in me if I were a book." She had hated him at the time and hated herself a little, but later, looking back, Hutter had decided that even if that particular boyfriend had been a book, he would have been one from the business and finance aisle, and she would have passed him by and looked for something in SF and fantasy. Hutter and Daltrey stood together in the almost empty parking lot. She could see into the sit-go through the big plate glass windows. The Pakistani behind the cash register kept flashing them nervous looks. Hutter had told him he wasn't under surveillance, that the federal government thanked him for his cooperation, but he almost certainly believed that his phone was tapped and they were eyeing him as a potential terrorist. "You think you should have gone to Pennsylvania?" Daltrey asked. "Depending on how this turns out, I might go tomorrow." "Fucking horror show," Daltrey said. Hutter had been getting voicemails and emails all night about the house on Block Lane in Sugar Creek. They had a place covered in a tent, and you had to wear a rubber suit and a gas mask to get through the door. They were treating the joint like it was contaminated with Ebola. A dozen forensic experts were in there, state and federal, pulling the place apart. They had been excavating bones from one wall of a root cellar all afternoon. The guy who had lived there, Bing Partridge, had melted most of the remains with lye. What he couldn't destroy, he stored, much the way a bee stores honey in little cells lightly muddled over. He had not gotten around to dissolving his most recent kill, a guy named Nathan Dementor from Kentucky, the corpse that Vic McQueen had mentioned on the phone. He had vanished a little more than 2 months ago, along with his vintage Rolls-Royce Wraith. Dementor had picked up the car in a federal auction more than a decade before. Its prior owner was one Charles Talent Mannix, former resident at FCI Inglewood in Colorado. Dementor had mentioned Mannix in the note he'd written shortly before his death by strangulation. He had misspelled the name, but it was pretty clear whom he was talking about. Hutter had seen a scan of the note, had read it herself a dozen times. Tabitha Hutter had learned the Dewey Decimal System and then organized the books in her Boston apartment according to it. She had a plastic box filled with carefully handwritten recipes ordered by region and food type, main course, appetizers, desserts in one category labeled PCS for post-coital snacks. She took private, almost guilty pleasure in defragmenting her hard drive. She sometimes imagined her own mind as a futuristic apartment with a clear glass floor, clear glass stairs, furniture made of clear plastic. Everything seemed to float, clean, dustless, ordered. But it wasn't like that now, and when she tried to think about what had happened in the last 72 hours, she felt overwhelmed and confused. She wanted to believe that information brought clarity. Not for the first time in her life, however, she had the disconcerting notion that it was often the opposite. Information was a jar of flies, and when you unscrewed the lid, they went everywhere, and good luck to you trying to round them all up again. Hutter inhaled the mossy-smelling nights, shut her eyes, and catalogued the flies. Victoria McQueen had been abducted at age 17 by Charles Mannix, a man who had almost certainly kidnapped others. He was at that time driving a Rolls-Royce Wraith, the 1938 model. Vic got away from him, and Mannix was jailed for transporting her across state lines and murdering an active duty soldier. In another sense, Vic had not escaped him at all. Like so many survivors of trauma and probable sexual assault, she was made a prisoner again and again of her addictions of madness. She stole things, did drugs, bore a child out of wedlock, and burned through a string of failed relationships. What Charlie Mannix had not been able to do, she had been trying to do for him ever since. Mannix had spent close to 20 years locked up in the FCI Inglewood Supermax. After drifting in and out of a coma for most of a decade, he had died this past spring. The coroner had estimated at his age at 90, no one knew the exact number, and while he was still cognate, Mannix had claimed to be 116 years old. The body had been snatched from the morgue by vandals, creating a minor scandal, but there was no question of his death. His heart had weighed 10.2 ounces, a bit light for a man of his size. Hutter had seen a photograph of it. McQueen claimed she'd been assaulted again just 3 days ago by Charlie Mannix and a guy in a gas mask, and that these men had driven off with her 12-year-old son in the back of a vintage Rolls-Royce. It had been reasonable to doubt her story. She'd been badly beaten, but her injuries might have been inflicted by a 12-year-old struggling for his life. There were tire tracks on the lawn, but they could have been made by her motorcycle as easily as by a car. The soft, wet earth held no usable prints. She claimed she'd been shot at, but forensics had failed to recover a single bullet. Also, more damningly, McQueen had secretly contacted a woman, Margaret Lee, a Heartland hooker and drug addict who seemed to have information about the missing child. When McQueen was confronted about Lee, she fled on a motorcycle, taking nothing, and had disappeared as if she'd dropped down a mine shaft. Miss Lee had been impossible to locate. She had drifted through a series of shelters and halfway houses in Iowa and Illinois, had not paid taxes or held a job since 2008. Her life had an unmistakable tragic arc. Once she had been a librarian and a beloved, if eccentric, local Scrabble competitor. Lee also once held a reputation as something of an amateur psychic, of occasional use to law enforcement. What did that mean? Then there was the hammer. The hammer had been on Hutter's mind for days. The more she learned, the heavier that hammer weighed in her thoughts. If Vic was going to make up a story about being attacked, why not say Mannix had come at her with a baseball bat, a shovel, a crowbar? Instead, McQueen described a weapon that had to be a bone mallet, just like the one that had gone missing with Mannix's body, a detail that had never appeared in any news report. Finally, there was Louis Comedy, Vic McQueen's occasional lover, father of their child, the man who had driven her away from Charlie Mannix all those years ago. Comedy's stenosis was not a put-on. Hutter had spoken to the doctor who treated him, and she had confirmed he had suffered from one, possibly two, pre-stroke events in the space of a week. He should not have left the hospital, the doctor said to Hutter, as if Hutter herself were to blame for his departure. In a sense, she was. Without an angioplasty, any strain on his heart could initiate an ischemic cascade. Do you understand? An avalanche in the brain, a major infarction. You're saying he could stroke out, Hutter said. At any minute. Every minute he's out there, he's a guy lying down in the middle of a road. Sooner or later, he will be run over. And still Comedy had walked out of the hospital, grabbed a cab to the train station half a mile away. There he'd bought a ticket for Boston, presumably in some half-assed attempt to throw law enforcement off, but then walked down the street to a CVS where he made a call to Dover, New Hampshire. 45 minutes later, Christopher McQueen arrived in a pickup, and Comedy got into the passenger seat, and here they were. So, what do you think Vic McQueen was into? Daltrey asked. The tip of his cigarette flared in the dark, casting an infernal light on his seamed ugly face. Into? She made a beeline for this guy Ping Partridge. She hunted him down to get information about her son, which she did. She said so, didn't she? She was obviously involved with some reprehensible shit buckets. That's why the kid was grabbed, don't you think? She was being taught a lesson by her business partners. I don't know, Hutter said. I'll ask her when I see her. Daltrey lifted his head, blew smoke into the pale mist. I bet human trafficking. Or child pornography. Hey, that makes sense, doesn't it? No, Hutter said, and began to walk. At first, she was just stretching her legs out, restless to move. Walking helped her think. She put her hands in the pockets of her FBI windbreaker and took herself around the deli truck down to the edge of the highway. When she looked across the road, she could see a few lights from Christopher McQueen's house through the pines. The doctor said that Comedy was lying in the road waiting to get run down, but that wasn't quite right. It was worse than that. He was strolling up the middle of the street, willfully walking right into oncoming traffic, because there was something at this house that he needed. No, correction, that Wayne needed. It was important enough that all other considerations, including Lou's own continued survival, could be set aside. It was there in that house. It was 200 feet away. Daltrey caught up to her as she was crossing the road. So what are we doing now? I want to sit with one of the surveillance crews, Hutter said. If you're coming, you'll have to put out that cigarette. Daltrey dropped it in the road and stepped on it. When they were across the highway, they walked along the gravel margin. They were 40 feet from the drive to Christopher McQueen's cabin when a voice called. Ma'am? Someone said softly. A small, stout woman in a midnight blue rain jacket stepped from under the boughs of a spruce. It was the Indian woman, Citra. She held a long stainless steel flashlight in one hand, but she didn't switch it on. It's me, Hutter. Who's there? Myself and Paul Hoover and Gabrielle Pelter. They were one of the two teams positioned in the trees watching the house. Something's wrong with the equipment. The bionic dish quit. The camera won't turn on. We know, Daltrey said. What happened? Citra asked. Sunspot, Daltrey said.